In today's video, I'll go through every movie about serial killers, and at the end, I'll share my personal tier list. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. The film follows the everyday life and violent crimes of Henry, a man who travels across the country committing brutal murders. The story mainly focuses on his relationship with Otis, a former convict, and Otis's sister, Becky. The movie is loosely based on the confessions of Henry Lee Lucas, an American serial killer, although many of his claims about the number of victims were later questioned by investigators. The film sparked controversy because of its extreme violence and realistic approach. It was briefly given an X rating in the US and faced distribution issues. The production budget was around $110,000. The movie's ratings are 7.0 out of 10 on IMDb. 10. Rillington Place. The film is based on Ludovic Kennedy's book 10 Rillington Place and tells the true story of British serial killer John Christie, who murdered several women in his home at 10 Rillington Place in London, and the wrongful conviction and execution of his neighbor Timothy Evans before Christie was caught. The movie's ratings are 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb. Citizen X. The film tells the true story of Soviet serial killer Andrei Chikatilo, who murdered dozens of victims in the USSR between 1978 and 1990. The story focuses on Detective Viktor Burakov and his struggles with bureaucracy and the system, which made it difficult to catch the killer for many years. The movie's ratings are 7.4 out of 10 on IMDb. Snowtown. The film tells the story of a boy, Jamie, who gets drawn in by the charismatic John Bunting into a series of brutal crimes. Their relationship takes him from trying to improve his family life to becoming complicit in horrific murders. The story focuses on this process of indoctrination and the escalation of violence. The movie is based on the real-life Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders, a series of brutal killings that took place in South Australia between 1992 and 1999. The movie's ratings are 6.6 out of 10 on IMDb. Summer of Sam. The movie is set in the summer of 1977 in New York and follows the lives of residents in an Italian-American neighborhood in the Bronx, whose everyday life is disrupted by a series of brutal murders committed by a serial killer known as the Son of Sam. The story focuses on a group of friends, especially Vinny and Richie, and their relationships as paranoia, fear, and chaos sweep through the city. The film is based on the true events of summer 1977, when serial killer David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam, murdered residents of the Bronx and Queens. The movie's ratings are 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb. Monster, 2003. The film tells the story of Aileen Wuornos, a former prostitute who became a serial killer. Between 1989 and 1990, she murdered several men, the film suggests 6 or 7, she met through her work, later claiming she acted in self-defense. The movie's ratings are 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb. Psycho. Marion Crane, a secretary from Los Angeles, steals a large sum of money and goes on the run. During her journey, she stops at an isolated motel run by the mysterious Norman Bates. The film follows a series of murders connected to the motel, including the iconic shower scene. Norman Bates's character was partially inspired by real-life killer Ed Gein, but the story itself is fictional. The movie's ratings are 8.5 out of 10 on IMDb. The Iceman. The film tells the story of Richard Kuklinski, an American hitman working as a mafia contract killer while living a double life as a devoted husband and father. Kuklinski carried out his criminal activities for many years, freezing his victims' bodies to hide the time of death, which earned him the nickname the Iceman. The movie is based on true events from Kuklinski's life and his work as a contract killer. The story is adapted from the book The Iceman, Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer by Anthony Bruno, along with real-life facts from his history. The movie's ratings are 6.8 out of 10 on IMDb. An American Crime. The film tells the story of Gertrude Banaszewski and her family, who, in the 1960s in Indianapolis, tortured and abused Sylvia Likens, a teenage girl left in their care. The movie shows the escalation of violence, psychological manipulation, and ultimately Sylvia's murder. It's based on true events. The torture and murder of Sylvia Likens in 1965 were documented in court. The movie's ratings are 7.2 out of 10 on IMDb. If you're still here watching this, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks. In Cold Blood. The film tells the story of the murder of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas, in 1959, committed by two criminals, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. The story covers both the planning and execution of the murders, as well as the police investigation, trial, and eventual punishment of the killers. The movie aims to maintain a documentary-style approach, staying close to Truman Capote's original book. The movie's ratings are 7.9 out of 10 on IMDb. Evelenko. The film follows the story of a fictional teacher, Andrei Evelenko, who becomes a brutal serial killer in the Soviet Union during the 1980s and early 1990s. The chronological narrative shows his initial problems, the escalation of his violence, and the years-long investigation by police and Judge Lesiev, which ultimately leads to Evelenko's capture and conviction. The film also includes a subplot about allegedly hypnotizing victims. This is a fictional and dramatic element, not a historical fact. Evelenko's character is inspired by the real-life Soviet serial killer Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Rostov Ripper. The movie's ratings are 6.1 out of 10 on IMDb. The Frozen Ground. The film tells the story of the so-called Butcher Baker, the real-life serial killer Robert Hansen, who between 1971 and 1983 in Anchorage, Alaska, kidnapped, raped, and murdered numerous women. The police, led by Detective Jack Halcombe, conduct a lengthy investigation that ultimately leads to Hansen's capture and imprisonment. The movie's ratings are 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb. The Gray Man, 2007. The film tells the story of Albert Fish, a real-life American serial killer and cannibal active in the 1920s and 1930s. It depicts his childhood, as well as his brutal crimes, including the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd in 1928, and follows Detective William King's investigation, which pursued Fish for many years. The movie's ratings are 5.9 out of 10 on IMDb. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 1976. The film tells the story of the Phantom Killer, a serial murderer who terrorized the town of Texarkana on the Texas-Arkansas border in 1946, killing young women. It presents a fictionalized drama based on real events, focusing on the town's residents and the local police trying to catch the killer. The movie is loosely based on the real Phantom Killer murders in Texarkana. The movie's ratings are 6.0 out of 10 on IMDb. Chugyokja. The film follows former police officer Aum Jung-ho, now working as a pimp, as he tracks down missing prostitutes from his business who have disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His investigation leads him to Ji Young-min, a client who turns out to be a ruthless serial killer. Jung-ho races against time and a flawed police system to save the last missing girl. The movie is inspired by the real-life crimes of Yoo Young-chul, who murdered multiple people in South Korea between 2003 and 2004, including sex workers and other victims. The film's ratings are 7.8 out of 10 on IMDb. From Hell, 2001. The film follows Detective Frederick Aberline in late 19th century London as he tries to catch Jack the Ripper, who was murdering prostitutes in Whitechapel. The story focuses on the investigation, political intrigue, and the dramatic attempts to stop the killer, blending historical events with fictional romantic and thriller elements. The movie's ratings are 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb, Texas Killing Fields. The film follows detectives Mike Suter and Brian High as they investigate a series of mysterious murders of young women in the Texas Killing Fields, an area along Highway 145 where numerous victims' bodies have been found over the years. The movie combines elements of a crime thriller with the personal drama of the detectives. It is loosely based on real events, including some of the unsolved murders in the Texas Killing Fields from the 1970s to 2000. The film's ratings are 5.7 out of 10 on IMDb, The Hunt for the BTK Killer. The film follows police officers in Wichita, Kansas, as they investigate the serial killer known as the BTK Killer. Find, torture, kill. Dennis Rader, who murdered multiple people between 1974 and 1991 while sending letters and taunts to the media and police. The movie portrays both the investigators and Rader himself, showing his double life. The film's ratings are 5.8 out of 10 on IMDb, The Boston Strangler. The film tells the story of journalists from the Boston Record-American who were the first to connect a series of murders of women into a single pattern, coining the term Boston Strangler. The story shows both the media side and the police investigation into the mysterious killings. The movie's ratings are 6.5 out of 10 on IMDb, Tales of the Grim Sleeper. This documentary examines the case of Lonnie David Franklin Jr., known as the Grim Sleeper, a serial killer who terrorized South Los Angeles for over 25 years, targeting mostly women from poor communities. Director Nick Broomfield conducts an investigative report, speaking with residents, friends, families of the victims, and local activists, trying to understand how such brutal crimes went unrecognized and ignored by the police for so long. The film also explores the social, racial, and class context surrounding the case. The movie's ratings are 7.0 out of 10 on IMDb, Zodiac, 2007. The film tells the story of the serial killer known as the Zodiac, who terrorized San Francisco and the surrounding areas in the 1960s and 70s. The focus is on the journalists and detectives trying to identify the killer, conducting a long and often frustrating investigation. The movie details the analysis of letters, ciphers, and clues, as well as the impact the case had on the lives of those involved. The film's ratings are 7.7 out of 10 on IMDb, Dahmer, 2002. The film depicts the life of Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, from his childhood and adolescence up to the discovery of his crimes by the police. The story focuses on Dahmer's psychology, his isolation, obsessions, and the violence that gradually turns him into a brutal serial killer. The film also explores the influence of his family and social environment on his development. The movie's ratings are 5.6 out of 10 on IMDb, My Friend Dahmer. The film focuses on Jeffrey Dahmer's school years, portraying him as a young outsider with a difficult childhood and emotional struggles. The story is told from the perspective of his classmate, Derf Backderf, who observes Dahmer's growing isolation and disturbing behavior before he becomes a serial killer. The movie emphasizes a psychological portrait of young Dahmer, his family and social relationships, and the warning signs that were ignored. The film's ratings are 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb, Dear Mr. Gacy. The film tells the story of Jason Moss, a law student who corresponds with serial killer John Wayne Gacy as part of his research into criminal psychology. The relationship with Gacy quickly becomes dangerous and psychologically taxing, revealing the manipulation, control, and immediate danger of direct contact with a psychopath. The movie focuses on the psychological cat-and-mouse game between the young researcher and one of the most notorious serial killers in the U.S. The film's ratings are 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb. Wolf Creek. The film tells the story of a group of tourists in the Australian outback who fall victim to the brutal killer Mick Taylor. The movie is inspired by the real-life crimes of Ian Craig, an Australian serial killer, though the story itself is fictional. It captures both the isolation of the setting and the mechanisms of psychopathic violence, as well as the victim's desperate struggle to survive. The film's ratings are 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb. Confession of a Serial Killer. After his arrest, Daniel Ray Hawkins begins confessing to the murders of over 200 women, detailing his brutal criminal path, the selection of victims, the killings, and the accomplices involved. Police initially doubt his statements until Hawkins leads them to a body and shows them photographs. The film presents his confession and gradually uncovers the dark aspects of his psyche. The movie's ratings are 5.8 out of 10 on IMDb. Silent Scream. The film tells the story of Larry Winters, a man sentenced to life imprisonment for the brutal murder of a bartender in London in 1963. It combines flashbacks from his youth in Glasgow, military service, and struggles with addiction, with his life in prison, where he is transferred to an experimental therapeutic unit. The movie explores his internal struggle, violence, and psychological decline through memory sequences and retrospectives. The film's ratings are 5.6 out of 10 on IMDb. Killer. A Journal of Murder. The film tells the story of Carlton Panzram, under a changed name in the movie, a serial killer who spends most of his life in prison. The story focuses on his journal, in which he details his crimes, his violence toward victims, and the brutal realities of prison life. The film examines the killer's psychological mechanisms, his relationship with the outside world in prison, and how keeping a journal becomes a form of introspection. The movie's ratings are 6.3 out of 10 on IMDb. The Red Spider. The story is set in 1960s Krakow during the PRL era. A young and ambitious teenager, Carol Kremer, is successful in sports and leads a good life, but everything changes when he accidentally witnesses a brutal murder. Intrigued, he begins tracking a suspicious man known as the Red Spider, a serial killer roaming the city. The relationship between Carol and the killer becomes dangerous and psychologically complex, leading the boy to confront the dark side of his own nature. The film is fictional but inspired by real events and figures, including urban legends and the story of Karol Kot, known as the Vampire of Krakow, one of the youngest serial killers in Polish history. The movie's ratings are 5.9 out of 10 on IMDb. Lonely Hearts. The story takes place in the late 1940s in the U.S. A pair of con artists, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, later known as the Lonely Hearts Killers, use personal ads to lure lonely women, often widows or vulnerable individuals, then rob and brutally murder them. The film depicts both their criminal activities and the efforts of two New York detectives, Elmer Robinson and Charles Hildebrandt, whose investigation leads them through a series of gruesome discoveries. The movie's ratings are 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb. The Alphabet Killer. The story is set in 1970s Rochester, where a series of brutal murders of young girls takes place. Detective Megan Page leads the investigation, uncovering a pattern. The killer chooses victims whose first and last names, as well as their hometown, all start with the same letter. Hence, the Alphabet Killer. Tracking the murderer becomes an obsession for Page, leading to hallucinations and a mental breakdown that costs her job and personal relationships. The film is inspired by real events, loosely based on the unsolved murders of girls in Rochester from 1971 to 1973, known as the Alphabet Murders. The movie's ratings are 5.2 out of 10 on IMDb. Der Goldene Handschuh. The film is set in Hamburg in the early 1970s and follows Fritz Honka, a socially marginalized alcoholic and a regular at the seedy bar known as the Golden Glove. There he meets lonely, often addicted women and invites them back to his apartment, where brutal murders take place. The movie focuses not only on the crimes, but also on the killer's grim everyday life, his isolation, sexual frustration, and gradual psychological breakdown. The film's ratings are 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb. Angst. The film is loosely inspired by the real-life story of Werner Kniesek, an Austrian murderer who, after being released from prison in 1970, killed an entire family. The movie follows several hours in the life of a freshly released killer who almost immediately returns to murder. The camera places the viewer inside the killer's mind. We hear his chaotic inner monologue and witness his impulses, frustrations, and paranoia. After breaking into a remote house, he tortures and murders its inhabitants, all presented in an extremely subjective, almost documentary-like style. The film avoids a traditional crime narrative, with no investigation or moral commentary. The movie's ratings are 7.2 out of 10 on IMDb. Woman of the Hour. The movie is based on a true story from 1978, when serial killer Rodney Alcala appeared as a contestant on the popular TV show The Dating Game. It follows Cheryl Bradshaw, who, completely unaware of who he really is, picks him as her date. At the same time, the film shows glimpses of Alcala's earlier crimes and captures the vibe of the 70s, when the system, the media, and society kept ignoring warning signs, letting the killer operate for years. On IMDb, it has a rating of 6.6 out of 10. He Went That Way. The movie takes place in 1960s USA. A young, charming hitchhiker named Bobby Falls gets picked up by traveling animal salesman Jim Goodwin. As they hit the road together, tension starts to build when Jim begins to suspect that his passenger might be a dangerous serial killer. The film slowly unfolds a psychological game between the two men, leading to a showdown where the line between victim and predator becomes increasingly blurred. It's loosely inspired by the real-life serial killer Larry Lee Reynes, who was active in the U.S. during the 60s. On IMDb, it's rated 5.1 out of 10. Boneyard. After the skeletons of 11 women and girls are found in the New Mexico desert, the local police team up with the FBI to catch a serial killer known as the Bone Collector. During the intense investigation, Police Chief Ortega, Detective Ortega, and Special Agent Petrovic have to deal with their own suspicions and conflicting leads, making the case even more complicated and casting doubt on even those trying to solve it. The film is based on the true events of the West Mesa murders, the discovery of multiple women's remains in New Mexico in 2009, though the story and characters are dramatized for the movie. On IMDb, it has a rating of 4.1 out of 10. Juji. Juji is a gritty, realistic crime thriller set in Rawalpindi. After a series of brutal murders, the local police, the idealistic sub-inspector Navid, and the cynical constable Arshad set out to track down a mysterious killer known as Juji. The investigation turns into an intense psychological game, testing their beliefs about justice, morality, and inner strength, as the hunt for the murderer exposes the dark sides of the city and themselves. The film is loosely inspired by real events. The case of a serial killer masseuse in Rawalpindi, Ajaz, also known as Jaji, who was allegedly suspected of murdering clients during massages. On IMDb, it's rated 9.5 out of 10. Green River Killer. The movie tells the story of Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, who terrorized Washington state in the 80s and 90s, murdering dozens of women, mostly prostitutes and young girls. It follows his methods, manipulations, and double life, as well as the detectives gradually piecing together evidence and investigating the string of brutal murders. The film focuses mainly on the killer's psychology and the atmosphere of fear in Seattle. On IMDb, it has a rating of 1.9 out of 10. Roberto Succo. The movie tells the story of Roberto Succo, a serial killer and prison escapee in Italy, who operated across Europe in the 80s and 90s, France, Germany, Italy. Succo was notorious for his ruthless murders, robberies, and thefts, living a chaotic and unpredictable life. The film follows both his crimes and his relationships with women, his escapes from the police, and offers a psychological portrait of the killer, showing his manipulations and complete lack of scruples. On IMDb, it's rated 6.6 out of 10. Squealer. In a small town, young women start disappearing, leading a police officer and a street social worker to investigate. Their search takes them to a remote pig farm, where the local butcher is doing far darker work than just processing meat, uncovering the grim secrets of a serial killer who hides his crimes among live pigs, carrying out brutally violent acts. The film is loosely inspired by real events, drawing parallels to Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton, who murdered women and hid parts of their bodies on his pig farm. On IMDb, it's rated 3.4 out of 10. Holy Spider. The movie tells the story of Saeed Haniyeh, a serial killer active in Mashhad, Iran, in 2000 to 2001, who murdered prostitutes, claiming he was cleansing the city of sin. The story is shown from both the perspective of investigative journalist Somaya, trying to solve the case, and the killer himself. The film explores the social and religious context of the crimes, the influence of ideology on criminal behavior, and the challenges police and media face in revealing the truth in a country with strict rules. It's based on real events, the case of Saeed Haniyeh, a serial killer from Iran. On IMDb, it's rated 7.3 out of 10. Badlands. The movie tells the story of a young couple, Kit and Holly, who, in the 1950s, hit the roads of South and North Dakota, committing a series of brutal murders and thefts. Kit is charismatic but psychopathic, while Holly follows him in an obsessive, almost mindless obedience. The film is loosely inspired by the real-life story of Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate, who killed 11 people in Nebraska and Wyoming between 1957 and 1958. Badlands explores the clash between innocence and violence, youthful delusions, and the American heartland of the 50s. On IMDb, it's rated 7.7 out of 10. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A group of young people traveling through Texas set out to find the family home of a deceased grandfather. Along the way, they run into a family of cannibals, including the terrifying Leatherface, who uses a chainsaw to kill his victims. The film focuses on the intense sense of danger and brutality, showing the panic, violence, and psychological terror the characters face. It's loosely inspired by real events, especially the story of Ed Gein, a serial killer and necrophile from Wisconsin. On IMDb, it's rated 7.7 out of 10. While making this content, I wanted to finish it with a tier list of all the movies I've watched. But there are so many I haven't seen yet that I came up with an idea. If we hit 1,000 likes on this video and reach 1,000 subs, I'll watch every single movie from this list.